I think we've got most everybody. We are going to jump back in to present two collaborative estuarine restoration projects within the region. First, we are going to have Zachary Schang. He's an environmental specialist and the assistant manager of the Northwest Florida Aquatic Preserve Office. Zach began his tenure with the DEP in 2006. Notes here. As the Living Shoreline Manager, he's handled the design, organization, and installation of small to medium scale shoreline restoration projects throughout Northwest Florida, with an emphasis on using natural materials. Zach has been involved with over 50 living shoreline projects to date, and today he will be discussing the progression of oyster shell recycling throughout the Panhandle from local to regional efforts.
All right. Thank you guys again for coming, and I'd like to start off by, I'm not going to name names, but some of the people in this room working years ago before I started with DEP kind of laid the foundation for me to do what I've done, and also all the work that Melody coordinated with prior to me even starting with DEP. It gave me the opportunity to be here and do all the things that I've been doing. But today we're going to talk about the oyster shell recycling program as it pertains to our operations and other operations. So when I started with DEP back in 2006, our recycling program had been a couple years running, and it was, the way I remember it, it was some of Melody's money was paying for employees to go out to a couple restaurants and collect oyster shells in 5-gallon buckets and dump them in a big pile at the nursery. And we were always having to deal with complaints from the other employees that were around it. And then us employees that weren't dealing with the oyster shells were complaining about the employees that were dealing with the oyster shells. But there were, the program was coined, Offer Your Shell to Enhance Restoration, because we love acronyms in the government. Thank you, Eric. But this graphic just kind of shows our cycle, and these are all pictures that these are all sort of connected. So except for the two on the right, obviously oysters are harvested for consumption and served in restaurants. And then they go out to, this is actually a site owned by Pensacola State College in Pensacola, West Pensacola, and the county helped work out an agreement to use this open parking lot to stage oyster shells. We started out putting them in a big pile, and we knew we needed time to cure them, but it took a while to cure. So laying out in this big open parking lot helped cure them. It helped with the bagging process, and you can see a stack of bags that we built in the reefs, and those reefs are actually several reefs down from this photograph here. So this is actually live oysters grown out of the reefs in this project in Bahia Grande in Pensacola. So this is a snapshot of our recycling program, and this is kind of how it is now. It started out a little bit. It was a learning process, figuring out should we use buckets, should we use cans, what kind of equipment do we need, and so with grant-funded employees, we were learning a lot of these nuances. Should we collect from every restaurant in town? Should we just collect from the couple that are in a line? So trying to get the most bang for our buck and then utilize the shell. So a lot of that it evolved through a coordination process. So all this PERT stuff that we're talking about, we've been doing the whole time. Just like I said, you guys did the work before I came into the DEP. We've been collaborating this whole time. And all the people in the room that are familiar just tells me that we have kind of the right ideas going, putting the professionals together. So recycling shell, you can do all sorts of different things with recycled shell. So we use recycled shell for living shoreline, but there could be a couple other uses, and we've also changed how we use shell for living shorelines because some things work and some things don't. When we first started the recycling the shell, a lot of it was used for projects that weren't necessarily living shoreline stabilization projects. It was just for restoration of oysters. So I'm going to give a couple examples here on an individual scale. KJMA is an old professor at UWF. He's since retired, and he used to get a box of oysters, and when he finished them, he'd come by the nursery and just dump them over the fence onto our pile. So he, as an individual, was helping us. It wasn't just this restaurant collection. So that on an individual scale, he was helping us. But I've also heard of people trying to do the same thing off the end of their dock, whether or not they were cured or not. They're trying to recycle shell because they didn't want to throw it in the landfill. So there's some areas that don't let you throw shell in the landfill, and here you can. But anything you do with shell that's not throwing it away is a good thing. But you have to complete that cycle somehow. So that was our cycle, but it doesn't have to be everybody's cycle. So some restaurants have their own leased beds. They don't give up their shell, sell their shell. They put it right back out so that they can build up their substrate. We've worked with a neighborhood association that wanted to do their own living shoreline project on a stretch of community-owned property. And we talked with them about who they could speak with about maybe collecting some shell, how we do it. And I don't know if they actually started collecting shell, but they were going to get their own trailers, work with the restaurant, and go out and do it. So then there's the effort kind of like we were involved with, where we have grant-funded employees, and we go out and we use the shell for restoration. Same thing with CBA. And coming up, Santa Rosa County is going to be operating, I think, a 3-year, Shelley, is that right? 3-year project with shell recycling. Yeah, so they're funded for a 3-year recycling project just for Santa Rosa County, and they're going to partner with, I think, a local landfill. And so they're taking some of the ideas that we've had and expanding it. So all these efforts can be scalable, and depending on what your end result is with that shell, you can just find a way to complete the cycle. So what we work on a lot is living shorelines. That's how we utilize recycled shell. So when we started, we were putting shell out in the water just for reefs. Then we used them for living shorelines, and we had some interesting results with dissipation of shell. So over the years, people started bagging shell. And so we have various results with bagging shell, and also there's experimentation with different types of bag material. Some bags last forever, some bags break apart quicker. But this is an example of it's sort of just a snapshot of the evolution of how we're using recycled shell currently. We had a living shoreline project. This is close to the Alabama-Florida line. And this shoreline got a lot of wave energy, and it was a part of an easement. The neighborhood association had an easement, so this person could not do hardened stabilization. They had to do, they couldn't backfill, they couldn't do riprap and backfill. They had to do some sort of hybrid project. So it was during a time where we were using recycled oyster shell bagged into bags near shore reefs. And after we were done, he went and piled concrete blocks on top of his reefs. Without asking, he just kind of did it because he was watching these 4-foot rollers come in and smash his property. So now, because we had some mixed feelings about the bags and how they would last, in 10, 20-year time frame, we've been working a little bit with hybridizing our reefs. So we don't have just recycled shell material in our reefs. We've adapted this process, and something that we're going to move forward with is having recycled shell basically be encased inside a reef and then veneer with a hardened structure. That way it can stand up to wave energy, and you still have that natural material. We're recycling that shell. So there were times where we weren't sure if right along the shoreline was the best place for certain types of material, and through collaboration, networking, exploring, we were able to find different ways to use that shell. And this is just a snapshot of another example of ways that shell could be used. I went to a conference and was approached by someone afterwards, and we started talking, and they put me in touch with someone who had developed a marine-grade epoxy. So this is basically just a glue that's used in several different shoreline applications, and they thought, hey, why don't we try it out with shells? It hasn't taken off, but it's just an idea of ways we can talk through different avenues and come up with new things because, if it's not broke, don't fix it, but if it can be done better, we want to try and do things better. So through the years, whether it was just one person picking up one bucket of shell or we have an entire county trying to find ways to collect every shell from every restaurant and divert it from the landfill, we can come up with ways to use that recycled shell. So that is basically that's my talk. It's short and sweet, just to give you an idea of how we use shell, how you could use shell. And this can be the start of a conversation. If you have ideas about how to use shell or have a need, then we can carry on in that conversation.
Questions?
We're going to do questions after each of these presentations rather than save them. So if you have any questions.
Yeah, so you were mentioning that you're sort of evolving towards using shell bags with other material. Is riprap or what other material?
We originally were using the fossilized shell material, but when that material sort of dried up, we started using some riprap in conjunction with recycled shell. Riprap, limestone.
Saw some of the hands back there.
Well, and with as Daryl mentioned, with the closing of the fossilized shell plant, and the number of projects that are going to be needing oyster shell material or some sort of material ramping up. How scalable is the oyster shell recycling program in the handle basis? I mean, how is it impractical to think that the oyster shell recycling could be scaled up enough to meet the need for material?
So the question was how scalable are the oyster shell projects given that one of the sources or the only source of fossilized shell may be closing?
Right. So I would say that it's not infinite. Obviously, there's only so much of it, but we're not collecting every shell that is being produced. So as long as there's shell that's going to the landfill, some of it's not being utilized for a recycling program. I'd say we're not collecting all of it that we can. So if there's a need and there's still shell out there, then we still can scale up, but it's not going to be infinite. That's why we have looked at other materials. But as far as scaling it, I think until every shell isn't being reused some way instead of going to landfill, then we still have room to improve.
Could you give me an idea how many cubic feet you're actually collecting in recycled shell? The numbers you have?
So for a year, Keep Pensacola Beautiful took over shell recycling from our organization. We kind of passed it off to them. And for a year's worth of funding, I think they would collect somewhere around 85 tons of shell. And that's 85 to 100-ish. That's with one supervisor and a couple volunteers going twice a week to 5 restaurants. That was the 5 restaurants. At one point it was over a dozen, but those are the 5 biggest producers that were all close to each other. And so on a year-by-year basis, it was about, I think it was close to a $25,000 or $30,000 grant to pay for all of the equipment and supplies and labor to get that from those 5 restaurants, but 85 to 100 tons.
Zach, I wanted to ask you about that reef that you showed where the property owner, so did you say that you put a bag shell reef there and the property owner came back and dropped riprap on it? Okay, so I'm assuming that was a permit violation.
It was a light
violation.
It was a what?
It was very, yeah, the delicate curve violation.
So-
Because it was all within the footprint, but it was a little bit more substrate than what we had said we were going to put down.
Is that the same kind of riprap that you're talking about having to, maybe consider using? And then, and if are you finding that that's functioned okay? And then I wanted you to address the kind of riprap that you are using and compare it to bag shell. And the bag shell has its own host of issues. It's plastic, our great garbage patch, is the, I know there's issues there, but if you could just speak to that, and if you would think, how you feel about using the riprap, how it compares. It's fossilized, and it's not fossilized, but it's limestone riprap. So.
Right, that's a good question, and so a couple questions. This is, I think,
recycled concrete. It's broken up concrete. And that is one of the materials that the DEP lists as suitable in their exemption language. There's a list of things that they're okay with if you're going for an exemption. So we kind of use that as a guideline. Limestone, riprap is also on that list of materials. And they like recycled shell. They want it to be consolidated. So in some areas, we do want some sort of bag or consolidation. We did a maintenance project on a living shoreline. We did a nice fill, and we were going to, basically we had bagged fossilized shell reefs that we were going to veneer kind of with our new method. And so the property owners needed to buy that material. And one property owner had a driveway that she was redoing. So she provided the recycled concrete for her. So on that particular stretch of projects, we used a little bit of recycled concrete and riprap. So when I go all over the place and see hardened shorelines, it's just riprap on the shoreline. And so the material is everywhere. And by using it in a living shoreline, we're just pulling it offshore, putting channel gas. We're just reusing that material in a slightly different way. And based on what we've seen, I would take a segmented riprap breakwater just offshore with natural vegetation behind it, as opposed to just a riprap revetment.